Welcome to Litigare's Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder resource page. This brief PowerPoint offers a good general overview of the human brain and the areas negatively affected by PTSD. In this presentation, we will describe the area and its function. Because PTSD can express itself in variations, we will not go deeply into PTSD symptomology. Please note that the locations of the brain in the provided photos point to their general locations. There are a few ways that PTSD negatively affects the brain. First, PTSD destroys gray matter, and secondly, it creates hyper and hypoactive structures of the brain. Before we go any further, it is important to identify the difference between gray matter and white matter. Gray matter in the brain is the router and processor of sensory and motor stimulus. Gray matter structures are also described as cortices, which process information originating in the sensory organs or in other gray matter regions. An example of a cortex is the prefrontal cortex or thinking brain. While white matter is comprised mainly of nerve fibers with their myelin sheaths, which gives the nerves its white color. White matter is the tissue through which messages pass between different areas of gray matter within the central nervous system. In its most basic form, white matter carries the messages that gray matter processes and creates. Hyper and hypoactive brain structures. Individuals with PTSD experience permanent alterations in brain structure. This can be seen through hyper and hypoactivation. For example, people with PTSD can present with a reduced size in the hippocampi. Hippocampi are generally known for processing memory. When a structure in the brain shrinks, it is called hypoactive or underactivation. The second change we see is when a section of the brain, for instance the amygdala, which is responsible for emotional control, becomes larger. When a brain structure increases in size, they call this hypoactive or overly active. Now that we have a good general understanding of gray matter reduction, along with hypo and hyperactive brain structures, we can dive into areas of the brain negatively affected by post-traumatic stress disorder. Amygdala. As described in the previous example, the amygdala becomes enlarged with PTSD. The amygdala plays a role in fear conditioning, works in conjunction with the inferior and middle occipital gyrus in processing facial expressions. Lastly, researchers are positing that the amygdala is responsible for the hypervigilance experienced by PTSD sufferers. The hippocampi. The hippocampi can become hypoactive in PTSD. Specifically, there appears to be damage in the anterior hippocampi, which makes critical contributions to episodic memory, imagination, and visual scene perception. The anterior portion of the hippocampi are involved in decision-making when confronted with an approach avoidance conflict. Approach avoidance conflicts occur when there is one goal or event that has both positive and negative effects or characteristics that make the goal appealing and unappealing simultaneously. Lingual gyrus. The lingual gyrus is linked to processing what a person sees, encoding visual memory, and plays a role in logically ordering events. Mid-cingulate cortex. This portion of the brain is an integral part of the limbic system, which is involved with forming and processing emotion, learning, and memory. The cingulate gyrus is highly influential in motivation or the lack thereof. Middle occipital gyrus. The occipital lobe's main function is visual and facial perception. Current PTSD research is showing a marked reduction in this structure. In other words, this section of the brain is responsible for how a person understands and interprets others' facial expressions. Orbitofrontal cortex. This section of the brain is responsible for decision making. Parahippocampal gyrus. The parahippocampal gyrus is a gray matter cortical region of the brain that surrounds the hippocampi and is part of the limbic system. This region plays an important role in memory encoding and retrieval. Putamen. A primary function of the putamen is to regulate movements, for example, the preparation and execution of movement, and is important to how people learn. When the putamen is damaged, like in PTSD, there can be issues with learning. Rostral and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. The rostral anterior cingulate cortex plays a direct role in negative self-views. It can contribute to depressive symptoms. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or DACC, helps to regulate thinking. It is also helpful in guiding reward-based decision-making and predicting task difficulty. Furthermore, the DACC plays a role in balancing or mediating conflict between competing responses from various structures in the brain. In other words, it helps the brain mediate when it experiences conflicting responses like pleasure and pain at the same time. It also plays a part in how a person appraises others in social situations and how a person self-evaluates. Thalamus. The thalamus is a large mass of gray matter in the brain with several functions such as relaying of sensory signals, including motor signals, to the cerebral cortex, and the regulation of consciousness, sleep, and alertness. Ventromedial and dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. The ventromedial cortex is in the frontal lobe at the bottom of the cerebral hemispheres and is important in determining what is a risk and a fear. It is also involved in inhibiting emotional responses. Lastly, this section is responsible for decision-making, self-control, and cognitive evaluation of morality. The dorsomedial cortex is where a sense of self is developed and is shown to be inactive when in a disassociative state. Disassociation is a form of avoidance. We want to thank you for taking this time to review this short general overview of post-traumatic stress disorders, negative effects on the brain. Please feel free to contact us with further questions. We're here and happy to help.